Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise again and speak to CETA in this House because I think there is a lot to talk about, and I don't think we've done a good enough job yet of discussing what's in this deal. There's a lot of platitudes from those who would support the deal, and I would say not a lot of information. We certainly haven't seen from the government any detailed study of what they anticipate the economic impact of this deal will be. Canadians are just supposed to take it on faith that somehow this is going to be good for them and for their jobs and for their communities. And I think it's reasonable that Canadians expect at any time, but particularly from a government who promised to make evidence-based decision-making and to bring a scientific approach back to government, that they would expect to get information and some analysis from the government in the particular ways that they think this deal will be beneficial, but we don't get that at all. Instead, we get just a kind of ideological repetition of the idea that these deals must obviously be good. So the NEP instead has been trying to offer an example of how you can look at an agreement, look at its details, and actually evaluate the various clauses and try to come to a conclusion about whether overall it's a good agreement for the country. And I don't think it's any secret that the conclusion we've come to with respect to this particular deal is that it's not on balance good for Canada, and I'm going to get into why. I think one of the things we need to do is to recognize, first and foremost, and it maybe sounds silly, of course you would think that this is the case, but when you consider the positions and arguments advanced by other parties, I think it bears repeating that trade deals are an important part of public policy. It's not like you have trade on the one hand and it's separate and divorced from the public policies of government, and then over here you have all the other public policies. Trade deals have important implications for governments, and in particular these kinds of comprehensive trade agreements set the economic framework and a number of other important rules under which government can or cannot apply other levers of public policy, Mr. Speaker. So consider, for instance, a previous trade agreement that Canada once had with the United States called the Auto Pact, where you had an agreement on the transmission of a particular kind of good, in this case automobiles, across the border. The people who negotiated and concluded that agreement recognized that trade deals were public policy. And so their public policy goals for that agreement weren't just to create more wealth for transnational corporations. What they said was that if we're going to sign a trade deal, then we need to enunciate what our public policy goals are, and an important public policy goal is to ensure that jobs are created within Canada and that goods being sold in Canada actually mean that Canadians get a slice of the production of that good and actually receive wages for the goods that are being sold in Canada. So when we talk about trade deals and different kinds and the values that can be represented in trade deals, Mr. Speaker, we have an example of not having to decide that simply because it's a trade issue, we need to just approve whatever it is that, let's face it, multinational corporations have negotiated with themselves because they're advising all the various governments that are involved in these negotiations, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, I mean, these are not negotiations where you have, you know, union leaders and people representing the interests of the environment and ordinary Canadians. They're largely negotiations with government representatives and the representatives of multinational corporations. They're meeting behind closed doors, and they're coming up with rules. And then when they come out of that negotiating room, we're told, well, if either you agree with trade or you don't, and this particular set of rules that we've gone away and negotiated behind closed doors represent the best possible scenario for ordinary Canadians. I think that's a laughable claim, Mr. Speaker. They never provide any evidence to actually back up that claim. We're just supposed to take it on faith. And when you look at agreements like this, it's not clear what the public policy goal is. Consider CETA, for instance. That's an agreement that we know, because it's been confirmed by a number of independent studies, is going to raise the cost of pharmaceutical drugs in a country that already has among the highest. So we need to go from where we are right now with respect to the cost of those drugs and find ways to bring it down. And we know that CETA moves us in the wrong direction. So what's the gain that we're making that offsets that loss? unless the public policy goal, perversely, of the government is to fatten the wallets of international pharma, Mr. Speaker. I don't think that's a defensible public policy goal, but if it's the goal of the government, let them say so. If not, let them tell us what it is that we're getting out of this deal that counteracts that for Canadians. If everyday Canadians are going to be made to pay more for their pharmaceutical drugs, what tangible benefit, because that's a tangible cost, Mr. Speaker, what tangible benefit can they expect to see? There are lots of other ways in which you could pursue, within the context of these kinds of trade agreements, other public policy goals. So you could say, for instance, Mr. Speaker, that because we want a green public transportation in Canada and with our trading partners, whether they be in Europe or the United States of America or wherever else, we'd like to have a firm commitment with timelines and penalties if these goals aren't met, to work towards a common charger for electric vehicles, for instance, Mr. Speaker. That would be a legitimate thing to do. Certainly, if a trade deal like CETA can pronounce on the minuscule details of municipal procurement, we could certainly reach a deal that brought its member parties together to pursue a common charging standard that would allow that industry to reach economies of scale, increase production, whether it's in Canada or the other member countries, and begin greening public transportation in those various areas. But we never hear about that because we don't actually get into a debate about what the public policy goals of a trade deal are. We're just told this is going to create massive wealth and it's going to be great for everyone and everyone's going to get a job after we pass this. The evidence doesn't support that at all. If you look at the historical record and what's happened to the Canadian manufacturing sector since the late 80s, early 90s, when we began signing these kinds of agreements, and no further evidence has been provided. So when we look at the historical track record, I'd argue it's not particularly good, and we're not being given any contrary evidence, Mr. Speaker. You might also say when it comes to labor mobility, for instance, these agreements tend to have lots of provisions about how companies can bring in their own workers from wherever it is that they come from to perform work here in Canada that ought to be performed first and foremost by Canadians that are looking for that kind of work. Well, that's not the right way to go about those provisions, Mr. Speaker. But we do know that there are labor mobility challenges. For instance, trade unions who have hiring halls have people here that are out of work, and there are places with demand in the United States. And those people can't get that work because in order to get authorized to do the work, they first of all need an employer, so they need a visa. But because there's an agreement where the employer goes to the hiring hall to fill their labor demands, the person needs to be cleared to work at the hall first. But until they're cleared at the hall, they don't have an employer. So they can't apply for the visa, and they can't be cleared at the hall until they have a visa. Now, there's a legitimate labor mobility issue, Mr. Speaker. We could be working to address labor mobility issues in that way, rather than in ways that encourage the import of temporary foreign workers who are then working only for that company and are, frankly, under a dictatorship of that country, because if they decide for whatever reason that worker is complaining too much about their working conditions, or if that company then doesn't pay them what they were promised when they came over, they can be sent out by that company. And so that's not a fair arrangement for those workers. It's not a fair arrangement for Canadians who are expected to then compete against them. And there are other ways to do that. But this doesn't come up when we're talking about these deals, Mr. Speaker. That's what the NDP is trying to do in this debate, is to say there are other ways of doing this, and there are other important public policy goals that ought to be taken into consideration when we pursue trade agreements. But successive Liberal and Conservative governments have failed to do this. And so that's the problem, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're trying to zero in on. We're trying to show that, yes, trade deals are important, trade is important, but there's more than one way to do it, Mr. Speaker. In fact, there's an infinite number of ways. This particular way, where we take away the ability of democratically elected governments in Canada and elsewhere to make decisions about health, environment, working conditions within their own jurisdiction and put them at the mercy of trade tribunals that are more concerned about whether transnational corporations are losing money than they are about the substance of those issues, is the wrong way to do it, Mr. Speaker. That's not to say that there isn't a way to do it, but it means that we have to ask more of our governments here in Canada when it comes to negotiating trade deals. Conservatives and Liberals alike have shown that they're not up to the task. And when we've seen a change in government, Mr. Speaker, we have yet to see a change in approach. We saw that when David Emerson switched from being the Liberal International Trade Minister to being the Harper International Trade Minister. And we saw it when this International Trade Minister hugged the former International Trade Minister on the floor of the House of Commons the day that CETA was signed. There's no difference between the two, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend again from Elwood Transcona for opposition to the investor-state agreements. And getting back to the core of this, one really does need to ask, how did we become so ensnared in so many of these agreements that only privilege the rights of foreign corporations? Canadian corporations can't sue under such provisions if the Canadian government makes a decision that hurts their profit. But if we accept this agreement, companies from Germany or Poland or Belgium or whatever would be able to sue the Canadian government, as now the U.S. government, U.S. corporations can. People's Republic of China corporations can, and if the TPP goes through, another 9 countries' governments, corporations from those countries can bring these private cases against Canada. Would he agree with me that we need to reopen the whole bundle of investor-state agreements and renegotiate them globally to ensure that they fairly balance the rights of corporations versus the sovereignty of governments?
Honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would agree with the member from Saanich Gulf Islands that there's something fundamentally broken at the conceptual level with investor-state dispute settlement clauses. There absolutely is. Giving foreign companies the ability to intervene in areas of domestic policy making for which we elect democratically governments to do is just completely backwards. And the idea that somehow, in order for those companies to get fair treatment in Canada, when we have a whole body of common law and other international agreements that give reasonable assurances to those companies that they won't be treated unfairly, is also wrong. So what's added to that, though, is a mechanism by which these transnational corporations can use the threat of serious financial punishment to governments in order to direct their policy behavior. That's what's wrong about that. So it's not about fair treatment. That already exists under the law before you sign these agreements. This is about whether you're going to give these companies the hammer and the threat of using it to direct government policy. That obviously is wrong, and it shouldn't be a component of deals going forward.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Essex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague from Elmwood Transcona for his speech today in the House on CETA. He brought up jobs, and we really need to have an understanding of what we face in CETA, but unfortunately we do not, because the current Liberal government has not done any analysis. We don't know what job losses could be projected, but we do have one study coming out of Tufts University in the States saying Canada will lose 30,000 jobs in CETA. And it's not just Canada that's concerned, Mr. Speaker, the EU as well. Just last week, the European Union's Employment and Social Affairs Committee voted for a motion saying that the EU Parliament should refuse to approve CETA because it would lead to the loss of some 200,000 EU jobs. So there is no evidence to back the potential jobs that we hear the government and the trade minister talking about all the time. Quite the contrary. What we only see going forward in Canada and the EU are job losses. So I want to ask the member from Elmwood Transcona, does he believe that we should have a full analysis of the job losses that will be incurred in Canada?
Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much for the question, and I think that's exactly what's required, Mr. Speaker. I mean, I can't imagine that a large company embarks on a new contract with a new supplier or a new partner without doing some serious due diligence. I can't imagine that in corporate boardrooms they sit down and say, hey, we've got the opportunity to have a partnership with a major new supplier, or we have a competitor, for that matter, who wants to join with us, and we're going to do a merger. And you know what? Because bigger is better and mergers are good, let's approve it. We don't need to take time to study it. We don't need any numbers. No, we believe bigger is better. That's a good economic principle. So we just need to go ahead. And all these questions are just slowing us down. And what we need to do as a corporate board is to stop asking questions about the money and stop asking questions about the jobs and stop asking questions about our obligations under new contracts. And we just need to plow ahead because this is a great principle. And we run our company based on principles. We don't run it based on spreadsheets or numbers. No. We run it on principles. There isn't a company that lasted a day in the market that runs itself that way, and Canadians should expect better from their government.